Okay, so I'm here with Hannah Pearsall, who is the head of Wellbeing at Hayes. Welcome, Hannah. How has your day been so far?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been brilliant so far. Thank you.
Yeah, good stuff. So you're a speaker here today, and what tell us
Yes,
just tell us a bit about well, maybe first tell us a bit about your role at Hayes and what that encompasses, and then we can talk about what you've been speaking about today
of
at the
course.
event.
Yeah. So as you rightly said, I'm the head of wellbeing for Hayes. So Hayes are a big recruitment consultancy. My remit is the UK and Ireland, and I'm responsible for having designed and deliver and continuously evolving our wellbeing strategy for our internal employees. So not our temps, but our permanent employees. And that's probably close to 2,500 employees across about 70 odd locations.
Okay, and how long have you been doing that role?
So I've been doing this role as it stands for about 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
been responsible and looking at wellbeing for about 5 years,
Okay.
and been at Hayes for 24 years.
Oh wow,
Yeah,
that is a good innings. That is a
long
good innings.
time, absolutely.
I can't talk. I was at an organisation for 20 years as well. So it's
Yeah,
full of many incarnations of the organisation. I
absolutely. It's
imagine.
been a journey for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just while we're on that topic, then how has it's quite a long time that you've been responsible in one way or another then for wellbeing in different roles. How has the picture changed in terms of how you set up for that and the strategic outlook, I guess, for health and wellbeing over that sort of whatever
Yeah.
5 years that you've particularly focused on that?
Yeah. Well, I think COVID served as a huge catalyst for change when it comes to health and well-being in the workplace. And I think prior to COVID, well-being was seen very much as an individual responsibility, something for people to take responsibility for outside of work. It was up to you to look after yourself.
Yeah.
I think COVID happened and there was a paternalistic approach, really. Organizations wanted to wrap their arms around people and look
Chief
after
care.
them, show them that
Yeah.
they cared.
Yeah.
And I think that was the right thing to do at that moment in time. But I think organisations that have continued to evolve are now recognising that well-being is very much a shared responsibility. And yes, an individual has a responsibility to take care of themselves, but so too does an organisation, in so much as work should be a place that contributes towards your health and well-being, not makes you ill, frankly.
Yeah, so real kind of evolution of the psychological contract, I guess.
Yeah.
And you've tried to, I guess you had your hand on the tiller of that. Is that the yeah?
Yeah, totally. I mean, looking at it from a workplace perspective, there are certain things you can clearly do to make sure that the environment is conducive to people being able to make positive choices when they look after their own well-being. But of course, what we can't do is control what people might do when they leave the workplace. So you can have all the best laid plans in the workplace, but if somebody goes home and drinks a bottle of wine every night and doesn't necessarily get enough sleep or exercise or take care of themselves, then it still doesn't work out well in terms of positive well-being. So it's very much a joint responsibility.
Yeah, no, and have you had a few goes at that, striking that the balance of, because it's like it is actually impossible to get that right first time. You're asking employees to take a certain amount of responsibility, aren't you, for their presence, their performance,
Yep.
and in return for all the good things that you guys are going to put in place and the ways that you support them. Has that sort of, were the messages received well the first time when you went for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about a continuous conversation with employees. It's listening. It's ongoing listening to understand what your employees need and want, and it's clear communication around what we're working towards. What's our goal when it comes to well-being? And we've tried to keep the definition of well-being at work really simple. We landed on feeling good and functioning well.
Hmm.
That resonates with everybody.
Yeah,
It means something
yeah.
different to everybody, but everybody knows what it's like to feel good and function well. And
So a
the
performance piece and a personal piece. Yeah.
absolutely, they're intrinsically linked, right? You can't perform well if you're not feeling well.
Mm.
And similarly, you're unlikely to feel well when you're not performing particularly well. So you've got to get the balance right, as you say. But I think it's about clear communication around expectations. What can an employer expect from us in terms of looking after them and creating the right environment? But in exchange, we need them to show up as the best possible version
Yeah.
of themselves too.
Yeah. And have you mentioned COVID there, and we were talking about employee both responsibilities but also expectations.
Mm.
Have you? There's a lot written about what's
Yeah.
happened post COVID, but have you sort of seen that employee expectations have shifted quite markedly in the last 2 or 3 years, and what ways?
Yeah, totally. And bearing in mind, obviously, the industry sector that we work in is recruitment. So not only can I say this on behalf of our own organisation and our own kind of employee value
Fine.
proposition, but the jobs that we're filling all the
Yeah.
time for a multitude of different customers. Absolutely. I mean, workplace well-being is higher on the agenda of expectations of employees at all age demographics. And I think there's a lot in particular in the news about perhaps the younger generation being the ones that are really saying, no, we won't accept anything less. But actually, it's across the board. And of course, whilst needs and wants might be different dependent on demographic, we all need to feel good to function well. So we've seen, mounting expectation on what employees are expecting from their employer when it comes to well-being.
And I suppose, yeah, so some of the people who perhaps the older generations or the midlife generations who had the quiet quitting thing, maybe they've got through that, but some stuff has stuck. Like they don't want to quit, but they do have some expectations.
Yeah,
things that
100%.
they want. Yeah.
We're seeing things like increased demand for support for women going through menopause. We're seeing a number of people who are now in the generation, the sandwich generation. They've got young children, but they're also caring for elderly parents or whatever it might be. So expectations shift and change as people change, and that's always going to be the case, which really feeds into the narrative around one size not fitting all when it comes to well-being.
And that must lead to some interesting conversations with your client organizations, the people you're recruiting for, because it's that thing of you're having to design jobs differently because of those expectations, but it's also the environment that you're sending them into as well. So there's you can put a lot of effort into saying a lot of stuff about well-being on a job advert, but if that doesn't match what
Absolutely.
you're sending people into,
It's one thing talking the talk, it's another, isn't it, when someone arrives in an organisation, and a big piece of that is often around culture, which, as you say, you can put all the right things on your website around what you will do for somebody, but really until they actually start in the role and see whether or not it lives up to the expectations of
Glassdoor.
been told.
And
100%. But that kind of transparency is important, right? Because something like well-being is quite difficult to measure. There isn't a standardized measurement for well-being that we can apply across the board and say, right, I can compare your organisation to your organisation. And Glassdoor clearly went some way to be able to do that for a multitude of different factors, but not necessarily in relation to well-being specifically. So it does become quite a challenge for employees who are potentially looking for a job to be able to assess where an organisation sits on that wellbeing maturity curve, really.
And I guess is it part of your internal wellbeing strategy? You have to kind of be a bit of a role model for those client organisations. Like, you guys have to get it right.
We try to. We're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And similarly, in my own role, there's a lot of expectation around role modelling, or what does good look like? If we are going to lead the way with wellbeing, and I'm often talking about how important it is that our leadership team understand that, and they are role modelling positive wellbeing in the workplace. But we're all busy. We've all got things to do, and sometimes it's difficult to take your full lunch hour and to finish on time. But it's all of these little things which they're not big initiatives. They are what you might consider just part of your everyday role, but they have a far greater impact than you might realise on creating that positive culture around well-being.
And I think it's as much about being seen to be trying to do the right things with role modelling, rather than being seen to always do the right things.
100%.
That's
100%. None of us are perfect.
it's intention,
right? And actually not being afraid to show that level of vulnerability sometimes when we get things wrong, or actually we've been burning the candle at both ends, or we just can't keep on top of the to-do list. We're all only human.
It's best authenticity, isn't it? Best to show that. So we talked a bit. You mentioned earlier about the kind of creating the right environment internally, which is obviously, when you think site contract, that is the employer's responsibility, isn't it, to get that part right, and whilst also listening to the voice of the employee. That's one of the things you've been talking about here today as a speaker, isn't it? In terms of I think champions networks, mental health first aid networks, and the work you've done to put that support in place as an employer. Just give us a bit of a feel for what you've done there and what you've been
Yeah.
talking about today.
So if we talk about mental health first aid communities specifically, we have worked incredibly hard to make sure that we recruit the right people, firstly, to be our mental health first aiders within our organisation. But perhaps more importantly than that is the wraparound care and programme, if you like, that sits around mental health first aid, because I think we speak to a lot of clients from a recruitment perspective who think that they've got mental health first aiders and therefore that's the mental health box ticked in terms of that's
Job done.
their silver bullet for mental health issues in the workplace. And I have been incredibly passionate about creating a program that enables our mental health first aiders to feel supported moving forward. And I make very clear that the first 2 days, the training course itself for mental health first aid training is the first step.
Yeah.
And that really is the beginning of their journey.
It's a real risk, isn't it? The productization of these things. So it's like, it's amazing that it's available and that it's become a thing, and that therefore, it's helped with the stigma piece, and it's also helped with the capability build piece, because you've got more people out there who can have these conversations. But it is a risk around productization that people just say, well, I'm going to purchase mental health first aid, and now that's everybody mentally well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For me, the important part is that aftercare of your mental health first aid community. So it's continuously checking in with them from a supportive perspective, but also from an ongoing development perspective, recognizing that some of them might not have a mental health first aid conversation for a couple of months after they did the training, and others will be out having them immediately and on a very regular basis. So having a form of escalation for people who have had challenging or difficult conversations and really recognizing the impact that has on their own well-being. I think the whole concept of putting your own oxygen mask on first is incredibly important when we talk about mental health first aid, and probably other employee networks and champions as well, because I think sometimes there's a perception that as a mental health first aider, you're shouldering this huge burden of looking after mental health for the workforce, and that really is misinformed. And it's incredibly important that boundaries are really crystal clear, and that mental health first aiders recognise
You're
the
not a
expectation
counsellor.
is not absolutely. You're not a qualified doctor after your 2-day course. This is about recognizing signs and symptoms, having a compassionate conversation, and effectively signposting. But that comes with its own need of support for an individual if they've had a difficult conversation that may have been activating in some way for them. Because again, we often find people who come forward to be a champion or a mental health first aider do so because of their own lived experience. So it's being really aware of that and putting the right measures in place to ensure that everyone is kept safe. Your mental health first aiders, the people that are reaching out to them, and anyone else that might be involved.
So there's a big part of that peer support. Have you created fora for peer support? Because, like, as you say, being able to share experience from people who have had lots of those conversations, some of them difficult. They themselves need support, but also the people who haven't had many conversations, they need to hear some of that. And
absolutely, yeah. We run a regular drop-in session for all of our mental health first aiders for exactly that. It's sharing reflections from their conversations. And that's not sharing detail like John in accounts is going through divorce and he's finding it really difficult. It's actually, I found a conversation about a relationship breakdown really tricky because it really made me reflect on my own situation. And so these are some of the skills that I used in that conversation.
How I navigated it.
This is how I navigated it. This is what I use from a signposting perspective. So that's really important, but also there's the ongoing measurement of impact of these things within the organisation, which can be really hard with something like mental health first aid, because clearly it is a confidential resource for people to reach out to. So I can't reach out to the business and say, who's spoken to a mental health first aider this month? But I can ask my mental health first aiders, how many conversations have you had this month? So we can at least track the fact that they are being used and utilised within our organisation. And that's also a way of ascertaining, well, who are the mental health first aiders that are having the conversations, and how do we make sure that those that aren't still feel confident to do so, and understand why they're not. If some are and some aren't, what are the barriers to that? Why are our employees not reaching out to them to address that and make it as impactful as possible?
And is the evaluation piece from both sides? So can you also get a general sense from employees in terms of, obviously not the specifics of what they're talking about, but how they rate the availability of and are you seeing does the story make sense, I guess?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. And we were talking obviously before about things like building all your mental health strategy, for example, into wider strategies like DE&I as an example, or wider people and culture goals. And an example of that has resonated really recently is I have recently sent out our first menopause survey. And one of the questions I ask in that is, what resources have you used to support your menopause symptoms?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, there were a surprising number of people that had used our mental health first
Okay.
aiders as a resource
Yeah.
to support menopause symptoms. So, yeah, we're seeing both sides of the story here. I'm finding out from employees, what are you using, what's helpful, but also checking in with those people that are providing that level of support to make sure they feel that they have the right skills, understanding, knowledge, expertise, and support to continue to do that.
And that goes back to that point about, you first of all, you've just got to do it with these things.
Yeah.
You've got to actually get
Gotta
it.
start.
You've got to accept that it's not going to, you can't know everything that you'll
Yeah.
know in 3 years
Yeah.
on day 2.
Yeah.
And that you've got to therefore be willing to hold that
Yeah.
and take responsibility for that as an employer, that you're gonna fail fast, you're gonna
Gotta be brave,
evolve
right?
this, you're gonna see that, you're gonna see the connections. When in my former life, I ran a business that did big health and wellbeing surveys for big corporates, and starting to take a data-led approach to health and wellbeing with a really solid sort of measurement basis for that. And in the end, you could be doing things that were really clever and predictive, and using things like the number of good days at work that people had to predict attrition.
Yeah.
But not in the first year.
No, absolutely.
Because you didn't understand
Yeah.
what was going on inside your organization. And I think there's something so it's that strategic outlook to say, we don't know today, but we will.
Yeah.
And it's a commitment that you're making, isn't it?
It is. You have to be brave. You have to just get started. You have to be open to feedback and criticism and challenge, and take that on board, and be constantly evaluating and reviewing what you're doing, because as you say, these things evolve anyway. So even if what we're doing today is working today, it might not in 6 or 12 months time, because
The need might
the
change.
landscape will have changed again. So being really aware of that and trying to be as forward thinking and as agile as possible to respond to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the interesting things with be interested to get your perspective on this. So when, again, in my former life, helping the organizations to set up champions networks, mainly wellbeing champions networks, but often they would have mental health first aid networks already.
Mhm.
So it's like there was always a question about what is the differentiation between those two roles, and often it was the same people who wanted to do it, and then there was an overlap. Let's say it wasn't always exactly the same people, but in my mind, and when I've worked with clients on that, there is a difference. Just interested in terms of how you frame that internally, and how you've kind of made that difference clear, both to the people who are doing the role and to the people who are on the receiving end of the role.
Ours are different, although there is a significant overlap, as you've rightly alluded to. Our mental health first aid program is an application process. So you have to apply to be a mental health first aider, and that has to include the backing of your line manager, both in terms of their perception of your suitability for the role, but also in terms of their permission to give you the time that is required to not only go on the 2-day training course, but the ongoing development and the time for the conversations. So that is very separate to our Wellbeing Champion Network, which is more about keeping wellbeing on the agenda every day, week, month of the year, and much more about supporting initiatives in relation to awareness days, promotion of different topics in relation to wellbeing or resources that we offer. Whereas I think our mental health first aid community, on one hand, is clearly a very reactive resource there to help people in a moment of need, but also play a really powerful role in breaking down the ongoing stigma associated with talking about mental health more generally.
So would you I mean, I suppose it, by its nature, well, I don't know, because it's a more preventative role, isn't it? The champion role, I guess, in one way. I mean, I suppose this is an interesting question about mental health first aid as well, because it's got a bit of a bad rap for basically being reactive, like physical first aid is. But I guess, have you found that there are ways to turn that role to be a bit more preventative?
I think so. I think one of the unintended consequences of having a mental health first aid program has been the opening up of conversations about mental health, particularly by some of our more senior leaders. So our mental health first aid community is across the business at all levels. And I was very clear about the fact that we needed to have some leadership mental health first aiders, but equally we needed people at all levels, because not everyone's going to want to talk to a director about their mental health. But having mental health first aiders who are also directors has sent a very important message to the business about how seriously we're taking mental health as a topic.
Yeah, it's an interesting. You could almost apply a maturity lens
Yeah,
to this, couldn't you?
absolutely.
In terms of, yeah, well, when people say that mental health first aid is reactive, perhaps
Yeah.
that's on day one. That's a
Yeah.
not in a business that is not mature around
Yeah.
health and well-being. Maturity is a common lens for things like health and safety, but less so for health
Yeah.
and well-being. But it's quite I've always found it's quite a good lens to talk to the board
Yeah.
through, because you can say, well, when we reach this level of maturity, these are the kind of conversations that mental health first aiders are. These are the kind of conversations that the champions will be able to have.
I think there's a step even before day one, though, with mental health first aiders, because if you haven't already been raising awareness about mental health and starting to talk about it, then nobody's going to talk to your mental health first aiders anyway, because it's still too alien a concept to talk about at work. So for me, it was very much a couple of years of actually just talking about mental health. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's use awareness days to shine a light on particular aspects of mental health. And then, as you say, it does become part of a much longer term sustainable plan to support mental health in the workplace.
Yeah. Okay, and then just sort of final couple of questions. I'm just thinking about, like, obviously your health and wellbeing strategy, which we started off talking about and which you're responsible for, is much broader than these sort of
Yeah.
support networks, which really enable you to implement and evolve the strategy. Well, where does it fit in? Like, what are the other key strands that relate to it, and where does this work fit into your broader strategy?
So our broader health and wellbeing strategy covers the 4 pillars of wellbeing. So we look at physical health, we look at mental health, we look at financial wellbeing, and we look at social wellbeing as well. So all of the work we've just been talking about sits in our mental health strategy, and we have a similar plan of attack, if you will, for each of the other pillars. So within all of them, we're looking at what are we doing from a proactive perspective? What are we doing to try and ensure that we have got tertiary level interventions? We're not just looking at fixing people when things go wrong. We're looking at really trying to understand the root causes for some of the issues that occur in these different spaces, and making sure that we've got what we can in place to mitigate some of the risks associated with poor wellbeing in each of those areas. But it absolutely can't be standalone, as you say. It can't just be mental health. It has to be all these different areas of health and wellbeing, and that itself needs to link to a broader people and culture strategy, because
Yes, of course.
there is so much overlap with DE&I and wellbeing. And inclusion is the glue that holds it all together, really, in the sense that you can't feel good and function well if you can't be yourself, and you can't be yourself if you don't feel belonging, and you only feel belonging if you have a culture that's inclusive. So it all has to work together, and it done right, it should, D&I and wellbeing and culture should complement and supplement one another.
Yeah, and I think the circle gets ever bigger around this stuff. I remember when it was just sort of stress and that was at the center of it, and then it started to broaden out, and you come to the 4 pillars, and I think people integration is at the heart of a good health and wellbeing strategy. But people are getting to the point where I do think things like DEI, and health and safety as well, the links between a bit more needs to be done. I think a bit more understanding about the links between them, in order to help people to draw a bigger circle around it, and therefore take a more strategic
And again,
approach to it.
I think that's another part of the evolution of the journey, really. I think, you talk about, you were thinking about health and wellbeing, and it was just stress risk assessments. I remember when D and I was just D. We only talked about diversity. You didn't know anything about E or I. And now it's everything. But I think my personal perception was that wellbeing at one point was very separate to D and I. And I believe that was right, because there are expertise around wellbeing that you need to have and understand to come up with and to articulate a wellbeing strategy, but it can't be in isolation, and that's the point here. I spend my entire working life collaborating with our DE&I lead, our head of reward and benefits, our learning and development team, our operational managing directors, because it has to run through everything we do. And we shouldn't just be looking at how do we do well-being. We should be looking at how do we integrate well-being into everything that we do.
Yeah, and lived working experience is driving it all
Yes,
together, isn't it?
totally.
You can't be in a senior role in an organization and see the things that go on and not make those connections. But then it's, how do you manage it in an integrated way? It's, as I say, the same, very similar stuff I've seen with health and safety. People that very often they're very separate inside organizations, HR and well-being over here, health and safety, and not having accidents over here. And but and at the antecedents of something that happens over here could be just the same as the things that happen over here, psychosocial risk and all of that. And I think there are things happening that are whether it's incidents or whether it's conversations or whether it's employee voice, there are things that are happening that are bringing it together. And probably a bit more needs to be understood in order to give people models to work with and work on that side of things. So interesting. So I'll just ask you one final question, Sen. So we talked about maturity. You guys do seem pretty mature in terms of what you're doing, both generally with health and wellbeing, but particularly around the the champions networks and mental health first aiders. What would be your one thing that you would say to somebody who was in a less mature position, an employer looking to get on this road? Maybe they're early stages with mental health first aid, or maybe they're even thinking about going down that route. What would be the learning that you've taken from all this to how to make the most of that opportunity?
I think it is about making sure what you do is evidence-based. I feel really strongly about that. And I think the evidence is there if you look for it. And it is about not just finger in the air, this feels right, we should be doing this. It's really make sure that what you're doing is underpinned with evidence and that it is fit for purpose within your organisation. You can't, as you said, you can't buy these things off a shelf and then be right, which means it does take time and resource to work out what it needs to be for your organisation. And that's really important.
Good stuff. Well, you should have a listen to our previous guest on here, Rob Breener, who was talking about evidence-based practice as well. So there's nice that we've got a theme going through our podcast today. Hannah, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time today and enjoy the rest of this show.
Thank you.
Cheers.